Marcus Vale's voice cut through the courthouse like a blade. "That woman is not Eliza Whitmore." He pointed directly at her, his finger steady, his face carrying the cold satisfaction of a man who had rehearsed this moment 100 times. "She is a vagrant, a lunatic who wandered out of the hills and latched onto a grieving man's desperation. And I will not allow this circus to continue one moment longer." Eliza sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap, but anyone watching closely could see her knuckles had gone white. 7 years. She had survived 7 years of darkness, of forgetting, of being treated as less than nothing. And now the most powerful man in Red Hollow was standing 10 feet away, looking her dead in the eye, and telling a room full of people that she did not exist. That were you if the person you once were had been erased, and the one man with the power to finish the erasure was smiling while he did it. What would you do? If this story already has your heart pounding, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss a single story, and when you finish watching, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The morning Ethan Whitmore changed everything. Began the way most mornings in Red Hollow did, quietly, with dust in the air and the smell of livestock drifting up from the lower pasture. He was 12 years old, and he had learned early that mornings were the safest time of day. His father hadn't started drinking yet. The ranch hands weren't arguing yet. The world hadn't had time to go wrong yet. So Ethan made a habit of moving through mornings carefully, like a person crossing a frozen creek light on his feet, always listening for the crack beneath him. He was cutting through the east side of town to pick up the flower order his father had forgotten for the 3rd time that month, when he saw her. She was sitting against the wall of the old feed store, the one with the broken sign that had said Harrow's Supply since before Ethan was born. She was not begging. She wasn't holding out a hand or calling out to passers-by. Just sitting, her knees pulled loosely to her chest, her eyes half focused on something in the middle distance that nobody else could see. She was holding a cloth doll. It was worn through at the shoulder seam, one of the button eyes hanging loose, the yellow yarn hair matted and dark with grime. But the shape of it, the particular way the arms were stuffed just slightly uneven, the small red mouth stitched slightly too far, left stopped Ethan's feet before his brain had caught up to why. He had seen that doll before. Not one like it. That one. He stood on the wooden walkway and stared at her, and she didn't notice him at first. She was humming something low under her breath, barely audible over the sound of a wagon rolling past. But when the wagon cleared and the street went quiet for a moment, he heard it. The melody hit him somewhere between his chest and his stomach, a place he didn't have a word for. It was the song his mother used to hum when she thought he was already asleep. Not a real song, at least. Not one he'd ever heard anyone else perform. Just something she made up. 3 rising notes, and then 2 falling ones, over and over, like a loop of thread that never quite knotted off. He had not heard that melody in 7 years. Ethan's flower order did not get picked up that day. He ran home. Caleb Whitmore was in the barn when his son came flying through the doors at a speed that made the horses shift and stamp. Caleb straightened up from the harness he'd been mending, one hand still wrapped in the leather strap, and looked at his boy's face. "What happened?" he said immediately, because Ethan's face was doing something it hadn't done in a long time. Open, raw, lit up with something that looked terrifyingly like hope. Papa. Ethan was breathing hard. He'd run the half-mile from town without stopping. "There's a woman by Harrow's." "What kind of trouble?" "No trouble. She's sitting there." He stopped, tried to get his breath under control. "She has Mama's doll, Papa, the one Mama made, with the red mouth and the bad eye, and she was humming Mama's song." The silence in the barn after that was the kind that has weight. Caleb put the harness strap down very slowly. He did not look at Ethan while he did it. He looked at the wall above the stall, at nothing in particular, and his jaw worked once without producing sound. "Ethan." His voice came out lower than usual. "Son, listen to me. I know what I heard. Ethan, I know Mama's song. The boy's voice cracked on the last word, and he pressed his lips together hard after it, the way people do when they refuse to let themselves cry. I didn't forget it, Papa. I've never forgot it. And she was humming it exactly right. Caleb closed his eyes for 3 seconds. The kind of 3 seconds where a whole argument happens silently inside a person's chest. Then he opened them again, and whatever decision he'd made was already sitting behind his expression, like something heavy he'd agreed to carry. "Show me," he said. She was still there when they came back. That was the first thing that surprised Caleb. He'd half expected the whole thing to dissolve, the way desperate things often do when you bring another person to look at them. But she was exactly where Ethan had described, in the shadow of Harrow's wall, the doll in her lap, her eyes on the middle distance. Caleb stopped 6 feet away from her. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, weathered in the way that men who work land get weathered. Not old, but marked. He'd been described in town, in the years since Eliza disappeared, as a man who had sealed himself off. Not cruel, not cold exactly, just closed, like a room where someone had shut all the windows and nobody had been back in since. Standing there looking at this woman, something cracked in that sealed room. He could feel it even though he didn't want to. She was thin, too thin, the kind of thin that comes from years of not enough, not from any single season of hardship. Her dress was someone else's cast-off, too large at the shoulders and too short at the hem. Her hair was tangled and streaked with gray at the temples in a way that felt too early. She couldn't be for more than 33, 34 at the most. But her eyes, when she finally registered them standing there and looked up, her eyes were golden brown with dark rings at the outer edge, and they were the exact eyes he had spent 7 years trying to forget, because remembering them hurt too much. "Eliza," he said. It came out like something he'd been holding underwater. She looked at him. Her expression didn't flood with recognition the way it does in the stories people tell about reunions. It did something more complicated and more honest than that. Something moved behind her eyes, a flicker, like a lamp catching in wind, and then her brow creased, and she pressed the doll a little tighter against her chest. "I don't," she started. Her voice was hoarse from disuse. "I don't know that name." The sound of her voice alone made Ethan make a noise beside him, a small bitten-off sound. Caleb reached out and put a hand on his son's shoulder without looking at him. "That's all right," Caleb said to the woman, carefully. "You don't have to know it right now." The town talked. Of course the town talked. By the time Caleb had arranged for the woman to be brought to the ranch, she'd come willingly enough, though with the wariness of a creature that had learned wariness as a survival skill. The story was already moving through Red Hollow, the way fires move through dry grass. Martha Greer, who ran the general store, and considered herself the civic conscience of the community, stopped Caleb on the street the following morning and told him plainly that what he was doing was not only foolish, but dangerous. That woman could be anyone, Caleb. Martha's voice had the particular quality of someone who believed they were being kind by being blunt. She could be running from something. She could be working a scheme. Grief does things to a man's judgment. "I'm aware," Caleb said. "Then you're choosing to ignore your judgment. I'm choosing to not leave a woman in the dirt who might be my wife." He said it evenly, without heat, which Martha found more unsettling than anger would have been. "If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but I'm not leaving her there to find out." Martha watched him walk away with the expression of a woman composing her next 4 conversations in her head simultaneously. The first 3 days on the ranch were strange. The woman Caleb refused to call her anything else. Not yet, not before she was ready moved through the house, with the cautious, exhausted quality of someone relearning how spaces worked. She touched things and then pulled her hands back. She stood in doorways for long moments before crossing them. But on the 3rd afternoon, Ethan found her standing in front of the kitchen window, not looking at anything outside, just standing there with her hand pressed flat against the wooden frame. She didn't hear him come in. "Mama used to stand there," Ethan said quietly from the doorway. She turned, startled. Then she looked back at the window frame, at her own hand against it. The light comes in different in the afternoon, she said slowly, like she was reading words off a page she was only just finding. There's something about this light. She used to watch the horses from there, Ethan said. He said the evening light made the brown ones look like they were on fire. The woman was quiet for a moment. Then, very softly, she said, "The bay mare, crooked blaze." Ethan's breath stopped. The bay mare with the crooked blaze had been put down 2 years after Eliza disappeared. She had not been mentioned in front of this woman. Nobody had told her anything about the horses. Her name was Cinder, Ethan whispered. The woman turned and looked at him fully for the first time, and her expression had that complicated, undone quality again, the flicker in the lamp. "Cinder," she repeated. And it sounded the way she said it, like the name of something she had been trying to remember for a very long time. Marcus Vale arrived on the 4th day. He came without warning, the way men with power tend to, because they learn early that warning gives people time to prepare. His buggy rolled up to the ranch house in the middle of the afternoon, and when Caleb came out to the porch, he found Marcus already climbing the steps like he'd been invited. Marcus Vale was 51, handsome, in the polished way that money makes men handsome, his gray suit clean, despite the dust of the road, his expression carrying the practiced warmth of a man who wanted things from you, but needed you not to know it yet. "Caleb," he extended his hand. "I heard the news. Wanted to come see for myself." Caleb shook his hand once, briefly. "Come to offer congratulations. Come to offer perspective." Marcus smiled, and the smile didn't reach much past his teeth. "Can we speak privately?" They stood in the yard, out of earshot of the house. "I've got connections to the county sheriff, as you know," Marcus said. "And what you're doing here, bringing an unidentified woman onto your property, presenting her to your child as his mother. There are people who'd call that reckless. There are people who'd call it worse." "What would you call it?" Caleb asked. "Call it grief-talking." Marcus's voice shifted to something that was performing sympathy. "You lost Eliza. We all know what that did to you. Caleb, this woman is not her. Look at her. Look at the state of her. Eliza Whitmore was a woman of quality, of standing. Eliza Whitmore was a woman who survived a flood," Caleb said. "What she looked like afterward is not the measure of who she is. Going to be talk. There's already talk. Talk I can manage," Marcus said, and the performance of sympathy dropped just slightly, enough for something colder to show through. "Talk I can steer. But if you push this, if you take this public, make claims, drag it into the courts, I won't be able to protect you from the consequences." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. In that moment, he was thinking about the land negotiations Marcus had been pressing him on for the better part of 2 years. The southern pasture, the water access, the quiet, relentless campaign of offers and pressures, and friendly suggestions that had been building since Eliza disappeared, since Caleb had been alone and diminished and easier to maneuver. "I appreciate the concern," Caleb said flatly. "You'll excuse me." He turned and walked back into the house. Inside, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table across from the woman, who was holding a cup of tea in both hands the way you hold something you're not sure you deserve. She had gotten thinner, somehow, since arriving, or maybe it was just that warmth and shelter were making the damage more visible, not less. She looked up when Caleb came in, and something in his expression made her set down the cup. "Who was that man?" she asked. "A neighbor," Caleb said. She didn't push, but her eyes moved to the window that faced the yard, where Marcus Vale's buggy was still visible in the distance, and she watched it for a moment with an expression that was not quite memory and not quite recognition, but something hovering in the uncomfortable space between them. "He doesn't want me here," she said. It wasn't a question. "A lot of people don't," Caleb said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he looked at her directly, without any of the desperate calculation that had been driving him. Just looked. "I'm not a lot of people." She searched his face. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this?" "You can't be certain." "No," he agreed. "I can't." "Then why?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. Not the version of the answer that sounded like a speech. Not the version that would have come from a man with cleaner grief and a simpler heart. The actual answer. Because sending you back to that street would have been something I couldn't live with, he said. And because my son heard that song, and because of your eyes. He paused. And because I'm not ready to decide I'm wrong. Not yet. She held his gaze for a long beat. I don't remember you, she said. I want to. I can feel that I should, but I don't. I know, that might not change. I know that too. Outside, the evening light shifted, and it came through the kitchen window at its particular afternoon angle, the one that had made the bay mare look like she was burning. Fell across the table between them, across her hands wrapped around the cooling cup, across the worn cloth doll she had set beside the sugar jar. It was a moment that deserved to be simple. It wasn't. Nothing about any of this was going to be simple. And both of them, in their different and damaged ways, already knew it. But Caleb Whitmore didn't move, and the woman who might be Eliza didn't look away. And upstairs, Ethan sat on the top step with his knees pulled to his chest, listening to the silence below with the particular attention of a boy who had spent 7 years learning how science could turn on you, and was only now beginning to wonder if it might, just this once, turn kind. The silence that followed Marcus Vale's visit did not leave the ranch quietly. It settled in, the way bad weather does not arriving all at once, but pressing itself into every corner until the air felt different, heavier, wrong in ways that were hard to name, but impossible to ignore. Caleb noticed it first in the way his ranch hands stopped making eye contact at breakfast, then in the way the woman he still hadn't let himself call her Eliza out loud again. Not since that first moment by Harrow's wall moved differently through the house after that afternoon, more carefully, more aware of windows. Like she had registered something in Marcus Vale's posture that her mind couldn't name, but her body already understood. She was sleeping in the guest room at the end of the hall, the one with the window that faced east. Caleb had offered her the choice of any room, and she had stood in each doorway for a moment before choosing that one. He hadn't told her that Eliza had always preferred the east-facing rooms, because the morning light came in first and she hated waking up in darkness. He hadn't told her. She had chosen it anyway. He lay awake the night after Marcus's visit thinking about that, not with hope exactly. Hope was a thing he'd burned through in the first 2 years after the river storm, when he'd ridden out searching 3 times, when he'd sent letters to every town within 100 miles, when he'd sat with Ethan on the porch every evening, waiting for something that didn't come. What was left in him now was something more cautious than hope and more stubborn than doubt. It was the feeling of a man who had decided to stay standing without knowing yet what he was standing for. In the morning, he found her already in the kitchen. She had made coffee. Not tea this time, coffee, in the blue-speckled pot that Eliza had bought from the traveling goods man this summer before she disappeared, the one Caleb had kept using out of habit, because throwing it out had seemed like a decision he wasn't ready to make. The woman was standing at the stove with her back to him, and she had put the coffee on without being shown where anything was kept. Caleb stood in the doorway. She turned around, saw his face, and looked immediately at the pot. "I'm sorry," she said. I knew where it was. I woke up early, and I couldn't sit still, and I walked in here, and I just knew." She set her cup down. "I can put it back." "You can't put coffee back," he said. She almost smiled. It was the closest she'd come to it since arriving, a twitch at the corner of her mouth that got most of the way there, and then stopped like it ran into something. "Sit down," Caleb said. "I'll take a cup." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and the morning light came through the window, and neither of them spoke for a while. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who had a great deal to say, and no language yet that fit it. "I had another one last night," she said finally. Her hands were wrapped around the cup. "A dream. Or a memory. I can't always tell the difference." "What was it?" She looked at the table. "Water moving very fast. And some things I was holding on to. Something I don't know what, some kind of wood, and I could hear a voice calling, but I couldn't see. She stopped. Doesn't come back whole. Just pieces. Like looking at something through broken glass. Caleb kept his voice even with some effort. The Taro River flooded in the spring of 1871. That was when. She looked up at him. You were crossing near the Gable Ford, he said. We'd had 3 weeks of rain. The water was higher than anyone expected. The wagon he stopped, because his voice was doing something he didn't want it to do. He took a breath and started again. They found the wagon 2 miles downstream. Found the horse. They didn't find you. She was watching him, the way people watch something they're afraid to see clearly. How long? She asked. 7 years. She absorbed that. The number landed on her face in a particular way, not with shock, but with a kind of slow, heavy recognition. Like she had suspected it was something like that and had been hoping it was less. 7 years, she repeated very quietly. Ethan was 5, Caleb said. He's 12 now. She turned and looked at the hallway, toward the stairs, as if she could see through the walls to where Ethan was still sleeping. The expression on her face in that moment was the most unguarded thing Caleb had seen from her yet. It wasn't soft. It was something more complicated, a kind of ravaged tenderness that looked like it cost her something to feel. He remembers the song, she said. He never forgot it. She pressed her lips together and looked back down at her cup. And Caleb watched her swallow whatever was trying to come up, watched her put something back behind her eyes and seal it there. He understood that. He'd been doing that particular thing for 7 years himself. The morning continued. Ethan came down at his usual hour, and the three of them ate together with the careful, deliberate normalcy of people constructing something fragile out of ordinary materials. Ethan talked too much, the way he did when he was nervous about the horses, about a problem with the fence line on the north pasture, about a dog he'd seen in town that he'd been thinking about bringing home. The woman listened to him with the particular quality of attention she gave to everything he said, like she was memorizing him in real time, storing each word somewhere specific. After breakfast, she asked if she could walk the property. Caleb said yes. He watched her from the barn while he worked, not constantly, just enough to know where she was. She moved slowly, touching fence posts and gate latches and the bark of the big cottonwood near the east pasture. She crouched down at one point near the old stone wall and stayed there for a long moment, pressing her hand against the top of it. Caleb knew what was on the other side of that wall without looking a patch of wild columbine that came back every spring, that Eliza had planted the second year they were on the ranch, because she said the color made her feel like the land was trying. He looked away and went back to work. That afternoon, Red Hollow delivered its first official response to the situation. Deputy Holt arrived just after 2 o'clock, uncomfortable, in the way that men are uncomfortable when they've been sent to do something they don't personally want to do. He was young mid-20s with the kind of honest face that made him poorly suited for political errands. Stood on the porch and turned his hat in his hands and told Caleb that Sheriff Granger had received a complaint. An inquiry, actually. That was the word the deputy used, clearly the word he'd been given. An inquiry from a concerned citizen regarding the unknown woman staying at the Whitmore ranch. A concerned citizen, Caleb said. Yes, sir. Did this citizen give his name? Deputy Holt looked at his hat. I'm not at liberty to say. Caleb looked at the deputy for a moment, then stepped aside and held the door open. You'd better come in and see her then, since that seems to be what this is about. The woman was in the sitting room when they came in. She was mending one of Ethan's shirts she had found the sewing basket without being directed to it, in the cedar chest at the foot of the stairs, which was where Eliza had always kept it, and she looked up when the deputy entered. Deputy Holt stopped moving. He stared at her with the unguarded recognition of someone who has no reason to hide what he's thinking. He was young enough that his face hadn't yet learned to close itself off the way older people's do. I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am, he said, and his voice had changed something quieter in it, something that wasn't in the official errand tone he'd arrived with. What's your name? She asked him directly. Holt. Tom Holt. She tilted her head slightly. Holt, your father was, did your family come up from the south? Through Candler County? Tom Holt blinked. My father came up through Candler County. 20 years ago. How did you? He had a mule, she said slowly, like someone reading from a great distance. A gray mule that he was very proud of. He used to bring it to the... She stopped. Her hand, holding the shirt, went still. I don't know. The rest won't come. Tom Holt looked at Caleb with an expression that had set aside whatever official purpose had brought him here. My father sold that mule before I was born, he said quietly. He never stopped talking about that mule. Nobody knew him around here for that. There's no reason. He stopped himself, looked at the floor, then back at her. I'll tell Sheriff Granger the situation appears stable, he said. I'll tell him the complaint appears to lack foundation. Caleb walked him out to the porch. Be careful, Tom Holt said quietly, when they were out of earshot. Whoever filed that complaint isn't done. Men like that don't file one complaint. I know, Caleb said. The deputy nodded once, put his hat back on, and rode out. The inquiry was only the beginning. By the end of that week, the pressure had shifted shape. It was no longer coming from any single direction. It was arriving the way a siege does, from every side at once, designed to exhaust rather than to break. Martha Greer formally declined to extend the Whitmore account's credit at the general store until the situation was, as she put it, clarified. 2 of Caleb's ranch hands gave notice on the same day. They didn't explain why, and they didn't have to, because Caleb recognized the particular awkwardness of men who'd been talked to by someone with money. A lawyer named Prescott, whom Caleb had never spoken to, rode out and left a card with a note that said simply, If you require assistance navigating a delicate matter, I represent parties with an interest in a satisfactory resolution. Caleb burned the card. He didn't tell the woman any of this directly, but she was not a person who missed things. Whatever damage had been done to her memory had not touched her ability to read a room, to notice a shift in tone, to understand that the world outside the ranch was not neutral. One evening, she found Caleb sitting at the table with his account ledger open, staring at the numbers with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that kept coming out wrong. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then came in and sat across from him without being invited. How bad is it? She asked. He looked up. He considered deflecting, and then decided against it, because she was asking a real question, and she deserved a real answer. It's manageable, he said. For now, if nothing else changes. But things will change, probably. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You should let me go. The words landed between them, with more weight than she'd perhaps intended. No, Caleb said. Caleb, no. He said it the second time, the same way he'd said it the first time, not heated, not desperate, just settled. I'm not doing this to sacrifice myself. I'm doing it because I believe it's right. Those are different things. She looked at him. You could be wrong about me. I could be. That doesn't scare you? He thought about it honestly. What scares me, he said, is the thought of being the kind of man who sends someone back to the dirt because the alternative is inconvenient. He closed the ledger. I've spent 7 years being sealed up and careful and making all the sensible decisions. I'm tired of sensible decisions. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he could see her working through something, not just accepting what he'd said, but actually examining it, the way a person does when they're not used to kindness and aren't sure yet if they can trust the shape of it. I want to try, she said finally, to remember, properly. I want to try. Okay, he said. I don't know how, neither do I. But Ethan does. Ethan's been keeping things. He kept a lot of things. She didn't say anything to that, but in the morning she went upstairs. Ethan had a cedar box under his bed. He'd started filling it the winter after his mother disappeared, when he was 6 years old, and old enough to understand that memory could slip if you didn't hold on. Inside the box, a blue ribbon from a fair, a pressed flower from the south pasture, a hand-drawn map of the ranch in a woman's handwriting, with all the best spots marked in pencil and labeled in names that were private jokes Ethan only half remembered. 3 letters, folded careful. A small piece of blue-checked fabric from a dress. He sat cross-legged on his bed and went through it with her, slowly, each item. Some things she touched, and nothing happened. She held the ribbon, and it gave her nothing. Then she picked up the piece of fabric. Her hand closed around it without her seeming to decide to, and she held it there, and her eyes went somewhere that wasn't the room. "The dance," she said. Her voice came out different, quieter, and more certain at the same time. There was a dance in the community hall. It was summer. I wore this dress and I ruined the hem in the mud before we even got inside, and I was furious, and then I started laughing. Because what was the point of being furious about a hem? She stopped. Her eyes came back to the room, to Ethan's face. "You weren't born yet," she said slowly, "or you were very small." I wasn't born," Ethan said. His voice was barely there. "That was 2 summers before I came. Papa told me about that dance," he said. "You laughed so hard you cried, and you danced in the ruined dress anyway. Pressed the fabric between both palms. He asked me to dance before he'd even told me his name," she said. "I thought that was either the most confident thing I'd ever seen or the most ridiculous." Ethan made a sound that was a laugh and a sob pressed together, and he covered his mouth with the back of his hand. She looked at him, and the expression on her face, not quite a smile, but something older and sadder and more real than a smile, was the most Eliza thing Caleb had ever seen on her. And he was standing in the doorway, watching, and he had to look at the floor for a moment before he could look back up. The memories didn't come back in a flood. That wasn't how it worked. Came back the way circulation comes back to a frozen limb, slowly, painfully, in pieces, with gaps between the pieces that sometimes felt wider than the pieces themselves. She would know the name of a horse and not the name of a neighbor. She would remember the exact smell of the spring mud in the east pasture and not be able to recall Ethan's birth. But they came. They kept coming. And Marcus Vale noticed. He came back to the ranch on a Thursday, and this time he didn't bother with the pretense of a friendly visit. He came with a man. Caleb didn't recognize a thin man in a formal coat who carried a leather satchel, and introduced himself as Arden Crow, representing certain interested parties in the matter of the Whitmore estate. They stood in the yard, the same yard where Marcus had stood the first time, and Caleb stood on the porch steps with his arms crossed, and the conversation was a different shape than the last one. "I'm going to be direct with you," Marcus said. "The woman you're harboring has no legal standing on this property. Without documentation, without proof of identity, she has no claim here. Not to the house, not to the land, not to anything. She's not making a claim," Caleb said. "She's living here because I invited her to. For now," said the thin man. Arden Crow, in a voice that was professionally mild. "But if you were to pursue, for example, a legal restoration of her status, as wife, as co-owner of property," he let that sit for a moment, "that would require legal proceeding. And legal proceedings require evidence, documentation, witnesses." "I'm aware of how law works," Caleb said. "Then you're aware," Marcus said, "that I have more resources for a legal proceeding than you do, and that a court hearing on this matter would be public. The things that become public in a court hearing can be very difficult to come back from." It was a threat wearing the coat of a practical observation, which was Marcus Vale's preferred method. Caleb looked at him and thought, not for the first time, about the southern pasture, about the water access, about how Eliza's disappearance had made the land negotiation so much simpler for Marcus, and how the timing had always sat wrong with Caleb in the back of his mind, like a picture hung slightly crooked on a wall. He thought about that now, standing in his own yard, looking at Marcus Vale's clean suit and patient eyes. "Get off my property," Caleb said. Marcus didn't move immediately. He held Caleb's gaze for a long moment, the look of a man measuring how serious the other man is. Then he turned and walked back to the buggy with the steady, unhurried walk of someone who believes he has more moves than you do and can afford to wait. Arden Crow followed without a word. Caleb stood on the porch until the buggy disappeared, and then he went inside, and he sat down at the kitchen table, and he put his head in his hands for exactly 1 minute. Then he lifted his head and started thinking. He needed Not the one who'd left a card, needed someone who was not already purchased. He needed witnesses. People who had known Eliza, who could speak to things that couldn't be faked or coached. And he needed whatever it was she still carried inside her, that nobody else could carry the specific, private knowledge of a life that was hers before any of this. He went looking for her that evening and found her in the barn. She was brushing one of the horses not the right way, not the efficient, groomed stroke of someone who'd been taught properly, but the instinctive way, the long, slow strokes of someone who knew horses from comfort rather than from work. The horse had its eyes half closed. "I used to do this," she said, without turning around. "When something was wrong, I used to come here and do this." "I know," Caleb said. She stopped brushing. "He's going to try to take this from us, isn't he?" "He's going to try." She turned to face him. Her expression had settled into something he was beginning to recognize as her version of determination, not fire exactly. Nothing theatrical, a quiet hardness in the jaw, in the set of her eyes, like a door being locked from the inside. "Then we're not going to let him," she said. "No," Caleb agreed. "We're not. Tell me what you need." He looked at her. "I need you to keep remembering," he said. "Everything you can. Every piece, however small. Because what's inside your head is the one thing he can't manufacture and he can't take." She held his gaze. "There's something else," she said. Her voice had dropped. "There's something I remember, not clearly, not fully, but there's something about him. About Vale." She paused. "I don't think my being on that road that day was entirely an accident." The barn went very quiet. Caleb went very still. "Tell me," he said. She shook her head slowly. "I can't yet. It's not there yet. It's like trying to read something through frosted glass. I can see there's something, but the words aren't clear." She pressed her hand to her temple. "But it's coming. I can feel it coming." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The horse shifted behind her, and the lantern light moved. And in that particular light, she looked less damaged than she had before. Or perhaps it was just that he was beginning to be able to see past the damage to the shape of the person, underneath which was the same shape in all the ways that mattered, that he had been carrying around in his chest for 7 years, like something he'd refused to bury. "Okay," he said quietly. "When it comes, I need to know." She nodded. And outside, the red hollow night settled in around the ranch, with all its ordinary sounds, the horses, the wind in the cottonwood, the far-off bark of something in the hills, while inside, two people who had been broken in different ways by the same event sat with the understanding that the hardest part of all of this was not yet behind them. It was ahead. It was building. And neither of them, for all the quiet steadiness they'd managed to construct between them, was entirely ready for what was coming. But ready or not had never, in either of their lives, been the deciding factor. The deciding factor had always been this, whether you stayed or whether you ran, and neither of them was running. The hearing was set for the 14th of October. Caleb found out through Tom Holt, who rode out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning with the particulars expression of a man delivering news he wishes he didn't have. County Court had received a formal petition filed by Arden Crow on behalf of unnamed interested parties requesting a competency and identity hearing regarding the woman residing at the Whitmore property. The petition cited concern for public welfare. It cited the instability of the woman's mental condition. It cited with a precision that made Caleb's stomach turn 3 specific incidents of confused or erratic behavior that could only have come from someone who had been watching the ranch closely. "They've had someone watching," Caleb said. Tom Holt didn't deny it. "The petition was filed with documentation," he said carefully. "Statements. Signed statements from witnesses." "What witnesses?" "I can't tell you that." Tom's jaw tightened. "What I can tell you is that the judge assigned to this hearing is Lawrence Pell. He's a fair man. He doesn't owe Marcus Vale anything, far as I know." "Caleb," he paused. "Crow is good at what he does. You're going to need someone just as good on your side." Caleb had already written to 3 lawyers in the 2 weeks since Marcus Vale's second visit. One had not responded. One had responded with a politely worded decline. The third, a man named Samuel Birch, who practiced out of a town 40 miles east and had a reputation built on cases nobody else wanted, had written back with 2 sentences. I've heard of this matter. I'll come Thursday. Samuel Birch arrived on Thursday in a wagon that had seen better decades, wearing a coat that had seen better decades also, and he shook Caleb's hand on the porch with the firm grip of a man who had nothing to prove and wasn't trying to. He was in his late 50s, compact, with a white beard trimmed close and eyes that moved through a room, the way water moves through a landscape, finding every low point, every crack, every place where something might pool. He had argued 11 identity cases in 20 years. He had won 9 of them. He met her in the sitting room. He didn't try to charm her or ease her into conversation. He sat across from her with a notepad and a pencil and said, "I'm going to ask you things that are going to be uncomfortable. I need you to answer honestly, even when the honest answer is that you don't know. The worst thing you can do in a proceeding like this is perform certainty you don't have. Juries and judges, they can smell overreach. You understand?" She looked at him steadily. "Yes, good." He wrote something on the notepad. "Tell me what you remember. Not what you've been told since you came back. What you actually remember." It took most of the afternoon. He talked, and Birch wrote, and Caleb sat near the window and listened, and Ethan sat on the stairs outside the door in his usual spot and listened also. What came out of her in that sitting room over 4 hours was not a complete life. It was more like a shattered one, reassembled by hand, with gaps where pieces were missing, and rough edges where pieces had broken. She remembered smells more than images. She remembered physical sensations, the feel of the kitchen floor under bare feet in winter, the particular resistance of a specific gate latch, the way the cottonwood sounded in a north wind. She remembered fragments of conversation, tones more than words. She remembered the dance, the ruined dress, the hem in the mud. She remembered something else too. She hadn't spoken of it to Caleb since the night in the barn, the thing through frosted glass that she'd said was coming. But in the sitting room, with Birch's steady pencil moving, and the late afternoon light going golden and long, something shifted. Before the river crossing, Birch said, not looking up from his notes, "Walk me through that day." She was quiet for a moment. "I had been to see someone," she said slowly. Caleb looked up from the window. "Who?" Birch asked. Same steady tone. "A man named," she pressed 2 fingers to her temple, "Garrett. His name was Garrett. He had a land office. A small office near the post road, east of town." She stopped. "He had papers. He'd sent word that he had papers for me to look at. Something to do with the southern pasture boundary." Caleb was very still. "He told me that the survey line had been moved," she said, "on the official record, that someone had filed a corrected survey that put 40 acres of our southern pasture outside our deed." She looked at Caleb. "I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough to know that if it was true, someone was stealing from us. And I understood." She stopped again. Her brow furrowed hard. "I understood that the person who had filed the corrected survey was Vale, Marcus Vale." The sitting room was extremely quiet. "Took the papers," she said. "Garrett gave me copies. Put them in the wagon, and I started home and the river." Her voice fractured briefly. She pressed her lips together. "I don't know if the water was as high as they said it was. I don't know if someone knew I was coming back that road. Can't tell you that. I just know what I had in the wagon. And I know that when I came out of the water, the papers weren't with me." Birch had stopped writing. He was looking at her with his water-finding eyes. "This Garrett," he said. "Is he still in Red Hollow?" "I don't know." Birch looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "I'll find out." What Caleb found out in the following 3 days was both more and less than he'd hoped for. The land office near the post road east of town had closed 6 years ago. A man matching the description of Garrett, first name Walter, last name either Garrett or something close to it, had left Red Hollow sometime in the year following the flood. Nobody had a forwarding address. Nobody seemed to have looked very hard. The land records, however, were public. Caleb spent a day in the county land office going through survey filings, and Samuel Birch spent the same day going through them beside him. And what they found in the records was not a corrected survey, it was the absence of one. The original survey was there. A filing marked as amended was there. But the amended filing, the one that should have shown who had filed it, and on what basis, had a gap in the documentation. 2 pages missing from the official record. Not lost, removed. The binding had been cut. Birch looked at the cut binding for a long time without saying anything. "Can you use this?" Caleb asked. "I can use the absence," Birch said. "The absence is almost as useful as the presence, if you know how to argue it." He closed the record book. "This doesn't prove Vale caused the flood. Nothing will prove that. But it establishes that she had a reason to be targeted, and that someone with access to these records had a reason to want her gone." He paused. "It also establishes that she knew things, specific things about Vale's activities that someone with no genuine connection to the Whitmore family and that land would have absolutely no reason to know." He looked at Caleb. "She's the most credible witness we have," he said. "Which means Crow is going to go after her memory like it's the only thing standing between his client and a verdict." And he's right, it is. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the longest 2 weeks Caleb could remember, and he had lived through some long weeks. The ranch ran on a kind of controlled tension that everyone on the property could feel, the ranch hands who hadn't quit, the 2 who'd come back after leaving, the rhythms of daily work conducted against the background hum of something unresolved. She spent those weeks remembering with a ferocity that sometimes alarmed him. Pushed herself past the point of comfort consistently and without apology. She would sit with Ethan's cedar box for hours. She would walk the property and touch things and stand very still and wait. She started asking Caleb questions directly about specific people, specific events, specific details not to be told what to say in the hearing, but to use his answers as keys, turning them in doors that were still mostly locked. Some doors opened. The name of the woman who had helped her in her first labor. The song, not just the melody, but 2 of the words she'd made up for it, which she produced one morning at breakfast with the startled expression of someone who has just found something they'd given up looking for. The location of a particular loose board in the floor of the master bedroom, under which she had kept a small amount of her own money in a tobacco tin, because, as she had apparently once told Caleb and now told him again, without knowing she was repeating herself, a woman should always have money that is entirely her own. Caleb checked the floorboard. The tobacco tin was still there, undisturbed, exactly where she said. He sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time after finding it. Ethan's response to the approaching hearing was to become very quiet and very purposeful in the way that 12-year-old boys become when they understand that something serious is happening and they are not the one who gets to fix it. He did his work without being asked. He was careful with her in the particular way of someone walking near something precious that might break. And one evening, 4 days before the hearing, he knocked on the door of the guest room, her room, and stood in the doorway with the cedar box in his hands. "I want you to have this," he said, for the hearing, to have. She looked at the box and then at his face. "Ethan," she said carefully, "that's yours, I know. But I made it for you." He said it with the directness of someone who has thought about something for a long time and has run out of reasons to circle around it. "I started keeping things in there because I didn't want to forget, but I think," his voice wavered, steadied, "I think you need to remember more than I need to not forget." She stood up from the chair she'd been sitting in and crossed the room to the doorway and took the box from his hands. And then she put her arms around him, and he stood stiff for exactly 1 second, the way boys that age do when affection surprises them. And then he leaned in and held on, with the desperate contained strength of 7 years of missing. Neither of them said anything for a while. Caleb saw it from the hallway. He turned around and went back downstairs, before either of them saw him, and he stood in the kitchen, with his hands braced on the edge of the counter, and his head down, and let something move through him that had been looking for a way out for a very long time. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and cold, with a high, thin overcast that made the light flat and ungenerous. They rode to the county courthouse in the ranch wagon, the 3 of them, with Samuel Birch following behind in his battered wagon. Ethan sat between the two adults with the cedar box on his lap, which nobody had told him to bring, but which nobody told him to leave behind either. Courthouse in Red Hollow was a modest building. For the power it held 2 stories, whitewashed plank siding, a single courtroom on the upper floor that smelled of linseed oil and old paper. When Caleb walked in with her on one side and Ethan on the other, the room was already half full, and the half that was full went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when the subject of the conversation has just walked in. Marcus Vale was already seated on the far side in a good coat, with Arden Crow beside him, and 2 other men Caleb didn't recognize on the other side of Crow. Marcus did not look at Caleb when he came in. He looked at her. The look lasted only a moment, a flicker of assessment, cold and measuring, and then his eyes moved away, as if he'd checked something off a list. Judge Lawrence Pell was a lean man in his 60s with a gray mustache and the bearing of someone who had been argued at by professionals for decades and had developed a comprehensive immunity to performance. He looked at both tables with equal lack of expression, settled his papers, and said in a voice that carried without effort, "We are here on the matter of the identity petition filed against one Jane Doe, residing at the Whitmore Ranch. Mr. Crow, you filed? You'll go first." Arden Crow stood and the performance began. He was good. Caleb had expected that, but watching it was still something else. Crow had the particular talent of a man who could make reasonable doubt sound like compassionate concern. He spoke about the vulnerability of a grieving family. He spoke about the dangers of wishful thinking. He produced 3 witnesses, a woman from town who testified she had seen the Jane Doe wandering disoriented near the river 2 years ago, more than 100 miles from Red Hollow, a man who claimed he'd spoken to her in a work camp the following winter, and she'd given a different name, a doctor who had examined her briefly at Crow's arrangement and testified that her memory disorder was, in his professional opinion, consistent with a woman who had constructed an identity rather than recovered one. Caleb watched her face through all of this. She kept it controlled, not blank controlled. There was a difference. Blank is a wall. Controlled is a wall that something is pressing against from the inside. When Crow sat down, Birch stood up. He called his own witnesses first, before putting her on the stand, and the witnesses he'd assembled in 2 weeks of quiet work were not numerous, but they were specific. A woman named Agnes Calloway, who had been the schoolteacher in Red Hollow for 30 years and had known Eliza Whitmore from childhood, testified about a birthmark, a small irregular mark behind the left ear, which she had seen herself when Eliza was a girl, and then stated for the court that she had seen the same mark on the woman at the defendant's table. Agnes was 81 years old, and her voice shook, but her eyes did not. A man named Pete Dunbar, who had worked on the Whitmore Ranch for 6 years before moving south, testified about a riding accident in the summer of 1868 in which Eliza Whitmore had broken 2 fingers on her left hand, badly enough that they had healed slightly crooked. He had helped set them. He described the exact nature of the break, described which 2 fingers. Birch asked the woman at the table to hold up her left hand for the court. Courtroom was very quiet while people looked at the 2 fingers that had healed, slightly crooked. The Dr. Crow had brought rolled his eyes visibly. Birch noted it for the record. Then Birch called her to the stand. She walked to the witness chair with the steadiness of a person who had made a decision before they got up that morning and was not going to revisit it. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at Judge Pell and then at Birch, and nowhere at Marcus Vale. Birch took her through it gently, but without softening anything. He asked about the ranch, about specific features of the property that were not on any public record, about people, the names, the details, the small private histories, answered what she could and said plainly when she couldn't, and her plainness about the limits of her memory was, as Birch had predicted, more persuasive than false certainty would have been. Then Crow rose for his cross-examination. He was polite. That was the first thing, almost elaborately polite. The way people are when they intend to dismantle something carefully rather than break it. He asked her to confirm, one by one, the gaps in her account, the things she couldn't remember. The years between the flood and Red Hollow. He lingered over those years with a patience that was designed to make them loom larger in the room's imagination. "You have no documentation of who you were in those years," he said. "No," she agreed. "No letters, no records, no individuals who can confirm your whereabouts. No. So for 7 years you existed without a name, without anyone who can place you." "I existed," she said. "I can't speak to what anyone can confirm." Crow paused, as if considering. "Then, Mrs. Whitmore, if that is indeed who you are, can you tell the court when your son was born?" She didn't hesitate. "March the 19th, 1864. Time, the hour of birth. A flicker. I don't know the precise hour." "Your husband was present?" "Yes." "Where was he standing when the child came?" Paused, and in the pause something moved through the room, the collective lean of people waiting. "He wasn't standing," she said. "He kept sitting down and then getting up and then sitting down again because he didn't know what to do with himself. He knocked over the water pitcher the midwife had set on the chair. Didn't break, but water went everywhere, and he stepped in it in his socks." Her voice, which had been steady and controlled, slipped at the edge of that last sentence, not broke, just slipped, the way a voice does when the memory it's carrying is suddenly, unexpectedly real. He was so embarrassed about the sock. From the gallery, a small sound, half law, half something else, from Agnes Calloway. Crow pressed on. "That's a charming anecdote. But without documentation, there's something else," she said. Crow stopped. Birch at the table went very still. This was not in their preparation. She had not mentioned this to him. Caleb watched her from his seat with his hands pressed flat on his thighs. She was looking at Judge Pell now, not at Crow. "There is something that only my husband and I knew," she said. "Something we agreed, when we first came to Red Hollow, that we would never write down and never speak of publicly, because it was the kind of thing that if the wrong person knew it, it could be used against us." Judge Pell regarded her. "You may proceed." She turned and looked, for the first time since the hearing began, directly at Marcus Vale. Vale's expression did not change. That was the thing about him. He was very practiced at stillness. But Arden Crow's pen had stopped moving, and the two men beside him had gone slightly rigid, and those were the things that couldn't be entirely controlled. She looked away from Vale and back at the judge. "When my husband and I first acquired the Whitmore ranch," she said, "there was a problem with the title. Prior claim, not formal, not recorded, but present. Family named Hess had worked that land for 3 seasons before abandoning it. They left without filing paperwork. But they left something else." She paused. "They buried a strong box in the northeast corner of the property, under the foundation stone of what used to be their smokehouse, with the original letter of agreement they had made with the land agent. That agreement, if it had surfaced, could have complicated our ownership of the land significantly. My husband and I found it 2 months after we purchased the property. The room was completely still. We chose not to report it," she said. "We buried it again, deeper under the same stone, and we agreed never to speak of it. My husband made me promise. I made him promise." She turned and found Caleb's face in the gallery. "We said that if either of us ever needed to prove to the other that we were who we were, if either of us ever lost our way, that would be the thing. Strong box. The Hess letter. That was our proof of ourselves to each other." The silence lasted several seconds. Judge Pell looked at Caleb. "Mr. Whitmore, is this account accurate?" Caleb's voice came out steady, though the steadiness cost him. "Yes, Your Honor. Every word." "And you have never disclosed this information to any other party?" "No, Your Honor. We have not." Pell looked back at her. Crow rose quickly. "Your Honor, there is no way to verify this account without going to look," Pell said mildly, "which we can arrange." He made a note. "Mr. Crow, you'll have opportunity to examine the location in question before I make any ruling." Crow sat back down. The rest of the hearing proceeded, but the room had shifted. Something had changed in the quality of the attention people were paying. The way attention changes when the outcome of something has moved from open to nearly closed. Not decided courts don't work on nearly. But nearly 2 days later, Judge Pell and a county assessor rode out to the northeast corner of the Whitmore property with Caleb and Birch and Crow and 2 other officials. They moved the foundation stone of the old smokehouse. They dug 2 feet down in the clay soil. The strongbox was there. Inside it, the Hess letter, exactly as she had described. Signed, dated. The name of the original land agent still legible. Crow examined it for a long time without saying anything. Pell looked at Caleb. "Mr. Whitmore," he said in the tone of a man who has reached the end of a calculation, "I believe we have sufficient basis for a preliminary ruling." Crow's preparation had been thorough. His witnesses had been real. His legal strategy had been built on the reasonable assumption that memory and sentiment were weaker than documentation and professional testimony. What he had not built his strategy to withstand was the specific, private, inarguable weight of a buried strongbox that only one person on earth could have known about. When the preliminary ruling came, 2 days later, delivered to Birch's office in a sealed county envelope, it was not a complete resolution, courts, and complete resolutions don't arrive together quickly, but it was an official recognition. The woman residing at the Whitmore property had demonstrated sufficient credible evidence of identity that the petition for her removal was denied. Further proceedings might be necessary to fully restore her legal status, but she could not be removed from the property. She could not be compelled to vacate. She was, in the language of the ruling, credible claimant to the identity of Eliza Whitmore, wife of Caleb Whitmore of Red Hollow. Birch read the ruling to them in the kitchen of the ranch house, with Ethan sitting at the table and Caleb standing against the wall, and her sitting in the chair near the window, the one that faced east. That got the morning light first. When Birch finished reading, the kitchen was quiet. Ethan looked at his father. Caleb looked at her. She was looking out the window at the east pasture, at the cottonwood, catching the afternoon light, and her expression was not triumph. It was something more complicated and more real than triumph, something that had earned its complexity through years of darkness and loss, and the long, painful work of clawing her way back toward a life that had not waited for her. "It's not over," she said, to the window, to no one in particular. "No," Birch agreed, "but it started." She turned from the window and looked at Caleb, and in her eyes was the exact mixture of exhaustion and determination, and something that was not quite hope, but was maybe the foundation of it, the ground floor. Rough poured, not yet solid, but there, definitively there, that he had been watching grow in her, since the morning she'd made coffee in the blue-speckled pot without knowing where it was kept. Marcus Vale was still in Red Hollow. He had left the courthouse the day of the hearing, with the controlled walk of a man who had been outmaneuvered and intended to respond to that fact with something worse than a court petition. The 2 men beside Crow at the table, men Caleb had not recognized, had been noted by Tom Holt, who had done some asking around and come back with information that settled in Caleb's gut like cold weight. One of them was a property assessor from the capital who had, in the past 5 years, been involved in the transfer of 11 disputed land parcels, all of which had ended in the favor of Vale-affiliated buyers. The other was a man whose name nobody in Red Hollow knew, which was itself. Tom said with quiet directness, "Something to worry about." "He's not done," Tom told Caleb, on the porch, the evening after the ruling came. "A man like that doesn't lose a court petition and walk away. He recalculates and comes at it differently." "I know," Caleb said. "You should know something else." Tom looked at his boots for a moment, then back up. "The man whose name nobody knows. I've seen him twice now in the past week, out on the Brace Road, which is the road that runs east past the Whitmore South pasture." Caleb looked at him. "He's not traveling through," Tom said. "He's watching." Inside the house, she was putting Ethan to bed, or rather, Ethan was at the age where he did not need to be put to bed, but had taken to sitting in the doorway of her room in the evenings while she read. the way he'd done at 5 years old, as if he was reclaiming something, as if they both were. Caleb stood on the porch, with the night coming in from the hills and the sound of the cottonwood in the east wind, and he thought about what was coming, and he thought about the strongbox in the ground and the frosted glass she'd described, and the things she still hadn't fully remembered about Marcus Vale and the road and the flood. He thought about the fact that she was here, that the ruling had said she was here legitimately, that whatever came next, nobody could take that away without going through something much harder than a court petition. He was tired. He was more tired than he'd been in years, the kind of tired that comes from finally letting yourself need something and feel the weight of needing it. But underneath the tired, something else had settled in that he didn't have a clean word for. Not peace. Something smaller than peace and more reliable. The feeling of a man who knows where he is and who's inside the house, and that the house is worth defending. Stayed on the porch a little longer. Then he went inside, and he locked the door behind him, and the night went on around the ranch, not kindly, not unkindly, just the way nights go on in places where people are fighting to stay. The man on the Brace Road had a name. Took Tom Holt 4 more days to find it, and when he brought it to Caleb, it came with a file of information that Tom had assembled with the careful, quiet thoroughness of a young deputy who had decided, somewhere in the past 3 weeks, that his official duties and his personal conscience were pointing in the same direction. The man's name was Cole Derry. He was 43 years old, originally from a territory 2 states east, and he had worked at various points in the past decade as a land surveyor, a courthouse records clerk, and most recently, as what Tom described with careful language, as a private contractor for parties with property interests. He had been in Red Hollow for 3 weeks. He was staying at the boarding house on Mercer Street under a different name. He had no stated business in town. Caleb read through Tom's notes at the kitchen table while Eliza sat across from him. She had started sitting across from him at the table in the mornings without either of them making a decision about it. It had just become the shape of the day. Coffee, the notes. The window that faced east. She read the name Cole Derry twice. "I know that name," she said. Caleb looked up. She wasn't looking at the paper anymore. She was looking at the middle distance, the particular way she looked when something was trying to surface. He was at Garrett's office. The day I went to look at the survey papers, she pressed 2 fingers against her temple. He was there when I arrived. He left when I came in, he went out the back. But I saw his face. Caleb set the paper down. "He saw yours," he said. The understanding of that moved through the kitchen without either of them needing to speak it further. Cole Derry had been at the land office the day Eliza picked up documents that implicated Marcus Vale. He had seen her face. He had seen what she was carrying. And 3 days later, she had gone into the Taro River, on a road she traveled regularly, at a crossing that should have been manageable. 7 years was a long time to carry that and not know you were carrying it. "I need to tell Birch," she said. "Yes," Caleb agreed. "Today." Birch came out that afternoon and listened to all of it without interrupting, which was his habit. He collected information the way you collect water in a dry season without wasting a drop. When she finished, he sat with it for a long moment. "Can you identify him?" Birch asked. "If you saw him again." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "You're certain?" He had a scar across his left eyebrow. From here to here, she drew the line across her own face with one finger, and he walked with his right shoulder higher than the left. I noticed it because it looked like someone who'd been thrown from a horse and healed wrong. Birch looked at Caleb. "Tom Holt's description," Caleb said quietly, "mentions a scar, the thing that Birch was building." And Caleb understood now that it was something larger than a defense, that it had become a different shape, entirely required one more piece that none of them had yet. It required a connection between Cole Derry and Marcus Vale that existed somewhere on paper, in a record, in a transaction. Verbal accounts and eyewitness recognition were valuable. They were not sufficient for what Birch was now considering. "There's a way," Birch said, standing to leave. But it requires time I'm not sure we have. Derry's been watching the property for a week. Men who watch properties eventually stop watching and start doing something else. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. After Birch left, Caleb walked the property perimeter in the last hour of daylight. Not out of any specific plan. It was the thing his body did when his mind was working hard, the physical movement that let the thinking happen underneath. He walked the fence line on the south side first, where the land ran toward the pasture that Marcus Vale had been trying to claim. For 2 years, the pasture that Eliza had been carrying papers about the day the river took her. He stood at the southern fence and looked across it, and thought about 7 years. He thought about the 5-year-old boy who had asked him every evening for the first year where Mama was and whether she was coming home. He thought about the particular evening he could still place it in the calendar of that terrible year when Ethan had stopped asking. Not because he'd gotten an answer, because he'd understood that asking wasn't going to produce one. There was something about a child learning to stop asking for the thing he needed. Most that did a specific damage to a parent, a damage that didn't heal cleanly, that left the kind of scar that changed the way you walked. He thought about the way she had held Ethan in the doorway of the guest room, that one evening, how the boy had gone stiff and then leaned in. He turned and walked back toward the house, and the evening light came across the cottonwood and the east pasture, in the particular way it came in that season, amber and long, making everything look slightly more permanent than it was, and he let himself feel, for just a moment, the plain weight of almost having her back. Not the complications, not what was still coming, just that. Then he went inside and started figuring out what came next. What came next arrived faster than Birch had predicted, and from a direction none of them had anticipated. The source was Agnes Calloway. Agnes was 81 years old, and she had lived in Red Hollow since before half the current residents had been born, and she had the particular social architecture of a woman who had outlasted everyone who'd ever underestimated her. She showed up at the ranch house on a Wednesday morning in a buggy driven by her grandson, and she came inside and sat at the kitchen table and took the cup of tea that Eliza across the table with the direct, assessing eyes of someone who had said her piece in the courthouse and had come to say more. "I have something that belongs in your hands," Agnes said. She had brought a letter. It had been in her possession for 6 years. She had not, she said with a precision that suggested she had thought carefully about how to characterize this, known what to do with it until now. The letter had been given to her by Walter Garrett, the land agent, on the evening before he left Red Hollow. He had come to her. She had been a kind of repository for the town's confidences for decades. Person you went to when you needed to leave something with someone trustworthy. And he had given her a sealed envelope and told her to hold it and tell no one, and that if certain things came to pass, she would know what to do with it. Certain things meaning what? Caleb asked. Meaning the truth coming to light, Agnes said, with the exactness of someone quoting precisely. Those were his words. The truth coming to light. The letter was written in Garrett's hand, dated 2 weeks after the flood. It described, in the careful, frightened language of a man who knows he is leaving evidence and knows he may not be safe, what had happened in his office the day Eliza came to collect the survey documents. It described Cole Derry's presence. It described the conversation he had overheard between Derry and a third party conducted in the back room of his office. Before Eliza arrived, in which the route she was expected to take home was discussed, and the condition of the Taro crossing and what the water level would be if the upstream millwork was opened at a particular time. The millwork. The upstream millwork, which was on land that Marcus Vale had owned since 1868. Caleb read the letter twice. The second time, his hands were not entirely steady. Eliza took it from him and read it herself. She read it with the stillness of someone absorbing a thing they already knew was true but needed to see confirmed. And when she finished, she set it on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when you're not sure what you'll do if you pick it up again. He opened the millwork, she said. Her voice was flat and precise. He raised the water. He knew I would be on that road. Agnes watched her. The letter doesn't prove it was his direct order, the old woman said carefully. But it establishes that Derry was involved, that Garrett witnessed things, and that someone with access to that millwork made a decision about the water. It's enough, Caleb said. He looked at Agnes. Why now? Why did you wait? I waited, Agnes said, because for 6 years there was no one to give it to. You were sealed up, Caleb. You weren't looking for anything. And Agnes looked at Eliza. She wasn't here to receive it. A letter of this kind needs to go to the person it concerns, not to a grieving husband making decisions alone. To her, nobody said anything for a moment. Eliza looked at Agnes, and something passed between the two women, not sentiment exactly, not the easy warmth of reunion, but something older and more durable. The recognition of a woman who had protected something at risk to herself and a woman who understood the cost of that. Thank you, Eliza said. Agnes finished her tea. She stood up with the creaking deliberateness of a woman who had been 81 for long enough to have made peace with how that felt. She looked at Caleb. You'd better get that to Birch today, she said, and you'd better move faster than Vale expects. She left. Her grandson helped her into the buggy, and they rolled out, and Caleb was already putting on his coat. Birch's reaction to the letter was the closest thing to visible excitement that Caleb had seen from him, which in Birch's case meant a slight quickening of his note-taking, and the statement, delivered with compressed energy. This changed the shape of things considerably. The millwork, Birch said. Do you still have the upstream millwork records? The county would have filed water use records for any major adjustment. Vale's land, Caleb said. His millwork, but county water rights. Any significant change to flow would have required a filing, or at minimum would show in the county water assessor's log. Birch was already reaching for his coat. The assessor's office keeps 7 years of records. We're at exactly 7 years. The next 36 hours were the kind that compressed time strangely long in the living of them and short in the memory, because every hour was dense with motion. Birch went to the county assessor's office. Tom Holt, operating now with the focused purposefulness of someone who had picked a side and accepted the consequences, provided unofficial access to records that an official request might have taken weeks to produce. Caleb stayed at the ranch because leaving Eliza and Ethan without someone on the property was not something he was willing to do, not with Cole Derry, still somewhere in Red Hollow, watching roads. Ethan, for his part, had developed the particular radar of a boy who understands that something serious is happening and has decided his contribution is vigilance. He had taken to checking the south fence line morning and evening, which Caleb had not asked him to do and did not tell him to stop. On the second evening of the 36 hours, Eliza found Caleb on the porch. She brought 2 cups of coffee and set one beside him, and sat in the other chair, and they sat with the night coming in from the west, which was the cold direction, the one that smelled of rain coming. Tell me something, she said. What? Something from before. Something I might not remember yet. He thought about it. Not the significant things, there were too many of those, and they carried too much weight for a porch in the evening. He thought about something small. You used to argue with the traveling seed merchant, he said. Every spring. He'd come through with his catalog, and you'd go through it, line by line, and find things wrong with his descriptions. You said he'd never grown anything in his life and was just copying what someone else wrote. Quiet. You were right usually, Caleb added. He didn't like you, did I care? Not remotely. She made the almost smile, the one that had been getting a little more all the way recently. That sounds right, she said. They sat with that. Caleb. Her voice change got quieter, more deliberate. When this is done, when Birch has what he needs and the court does whatever it does next, there are things I still don't have back. She looked at her coffee cup. There are days in our life together that are just gone. Conversations. Things you told me that I told you back. I don't know how much of it comes back and how much of it is just gone. I know, he said. That doesn't bother you? He considered that honestly. The way she had come to know, he considered things not quickly, not to reassure, But actually, part of you that picked the east room, he said. Part that knew where the sewing basket was. The part that remembered the dance and the ruined hem, and how I asked you before I told you my name. He paused. That's not the part that was going to be destroyed by 7 years of hard living. And the parts that got damaged, those aren't what I fell in love with. She looked at him. What did you fall in love with? She asked. And it wasn't a test. It was a genuine question. Asked with the directness of a woman who had stopped having the luxury of indirect questions somewhere in the years between the river and Red Hollow. The way you argued with the seed merchant, he said. The way you planted columbine because you said the land was trying. The way you kept money in a tin under the floor because you believed a woman should have something that was entirely her own. He paused. The fact that you got back up. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he could see her taking that in and deciding what to do with it, the way she did with everything, not accepting it, wholesale, not deflecting it, but actually examining it and finding the parts that fit and putting those away carefully. I'm still getting back up, she said. I want you to know that it doesn't feel finished, that I don't feel restored. I feel like someone who is still in the middle of something. That's accurate, he said. You're not going to tell me it's almost over? I'm going to tell you that. Even when the legal part is over, the other part takes longer. And that's fine. That's allowed. He looked at her. You don't have to be finished healing to deserve to be here. She looked back out at the dark pasture. The rain smell was getting stronger. Ethan checks the fence line every evening, she said. I know. He does it because he's worried about us. I know that too. He's not 5 anymore, she said. It wasn't a complaint. It was the particular ache of a mother who missed something she hadn't been present for. No, Caleb agreed. But he's still got time to be 12, if we give him the chance. The rain came in the night, and by morning, everything was wet and gray and smelling of turned earth, and Birch arrived at the ranch before 8 o'clock, with mud on his boots and a leather folder under his arm, and the expression of a man who has found what he was looking for and is already thinking 3 steps ahead of it. The county water assessor's log for the spring of 1871 contained an entry dated 3 days before the flood. An adjustment to the millwork flow on the upper Taro, filed under Vale's property number, citing maintenance. The adjustment, cross-referenced with the standard flow calculations, Birch had obtained from the county engineer's office, would have not certainly, not provably, with the precision of a laboratory, but would have, given the 3 weeks of rain already, in the watershed, raised the water level at the Gable Ford by a sufficient margin to make a crossing dangerous that would otherwise have been merely difficult. Not murder. No court was going to call it murder with that evidence. Fraud. Yes. Conspiracy to deprive, yes. Deliberate and documented manipulation of public waterway resources for private benefit resulting in harm, which carried its own weight in a territorial court, and connected to the survey fraud, to the missing pages in the land records, to the Garrett letter, to Cole Dairy connected, link by link, into a chain that was not yet a certainty, but was no longer a speculation. What do we do with this? Caleb asked. We take it to someone above Sheriff Granger, Birch said. Someone who didn't grow up in a county where Marcus Vale has been a large landowner for 20 years. He paused. I've already written to the territorial circuit judge. He rides this district twice a year. He's due in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Eliza said. She was standing in the kitchen doorway. Cole Dairy has been watching this property for 2 weeks. I know. Birch looked at her, which is why I've asked Tom Holt to make Dairy's presence officially known to the sheriff. If Granger refuses to act on it, Tom can go over his head. And if Dairy doesn't wait, Birch was quiet for a moment. Then we deal with what happens and adjust. He said it matter-of-factly, not minimizing it, just treating it as the kind of thing that had to be treated without flinching. That evening, Cole Dairy made his move, though it wasn't the move any of them had been anticipating. He came to the front door. Not in the dark, not through the south pasture, not with any of the threatening shape that a man who'd been watching from a distance for 2 weeks might be expected to arrive with. Came in the afternoon. Just past 3 o'clock, on a horse that wasn't his usual one, and he knocked on the front door of the ranch house with the knock of a man who has made a decision that surprised Exenson himself. Caleb opened the door with one hand visible and one hand not. Colderi looked older than his file suggested, or maybe it was the posture. He'd lost whatever neutrality he'd been maintaining on the Brace Road. His face had the particular quality of someone who has been thinking about something for a very long time, and has finally arrived at the end of thinking and the beginning of doing. "I need to talk to her," he said. He wasn't looking at Caleb when he said it. He was looking at a point somewhere past Caleb's shoulder, as if he could see through the house to wherever she was. "I need to talk to the woman, Eliza Whitmore." "Why?" Caleb said. Derry looked at him then. "Because I've been looking at this house for 2 weeks, telling myself I was here to finish a job," he said deep. "And I'm done telling myself that." Caleb studied him for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "You'll sit at the kitchen table," Caleb said. "You'll put whatever you're carrying on the table where I can see it. And you'll understand that if you came here to do harm, you're not leaving." "I didn't come here for that," Derry said. "Not anymore." Came inside. Eliza was in the sitting room. She came to the kitchen doorway when she heard the unfamiliar voice, and when she saw Derry's face, she went very still. He saw her recognition and didn't look away from it. "You remember me?" he said. "Garrett's office," she said. "Gar." He touched the line above his left eye reflexively. "Yes." He sat at the table. He put a folded paper on the surface, and then a small leather notebook, and then he put his hands flat on the table and looked at both of them. "Vale didn't tell me what the water would do to the crossing," he said. "I want that understood before anything else. He told me the adjustment was for irrigation. He told me the woman needed to be delayed. Not," he stopped. "I didn't know about the flood until afterward, and by then I was already in it. I had already been paid, and I had already done the other things, and there was no clean place to stand." Kitchen was extremely quiet. Eliza looked at him with an expression that was not warm and was not forgiving, because neither was warranted, and she had not offered them. It was an expression of a woman processing a piece of information about the worst days of her life, delivered by one of the people responsible for them, and doing that processing in real time with her face, because she had learned, in 7 years of having nothing to hide behind, that hiding was expensive. "Pages in the land record," Caleb said. "I removed them. Vale had me remove them." Derry looked at the leather notebook. "What I did and when I did it and what I was paid is in there. All of it." He pushed the notebook forward. "I've had that for 2 years. I've been carrying it since I decided I might need something between me and Vale if he ever decided I was a liability." He paused. "When the hearing happened, when she stood up in that court and the ruling came, Vale told me to come here and settle it." Quietly his word. "Settle it," Caleb said. "Yes. And you came to the front door instead." "I have a daughter," Derry said. His voice, which had been controlled, dropped slightly on those words. Just slightly, but it was there. "She's 9. She lives with her mother in a town east of here. She doesn't know what I do." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like her not to know." He looked at Eliza when he said it. She looked back at him, without softening and without harshness. She was thinking, and she let herself be seen thinking, which was something she had gotten better at, sitting with the discomfort of an unresolved thing rather than rushing to resolve it one way or the other. "What you did," she said, finally, "cost me 7 years. My son grew up without me. My husband." She stopped. "What you did is not a small thing. I don't know yet what I think should happen to you." She looked at the notebook. "But what's in that book, if it's what you say it is, will help make sure the person who ordered it answers for it." She looked back at his face. "I'll talk to Birch." Derry nodded once. The nod of a man who has not been forgiven and knows it and is accepting the accuracy of that. "There's one more thing," he said. He reached into his coat slowly with visible deliberateness, watching Caleb's hands, and produced a folded paper. "Vale has filed a new motion. I saw it before I rode out here. He's not going through Crow anymore." He set the paper on the table beside the notebook. "He's going to the Territorial Land Commission, directly, claiming the Whitmore deed itself is invalid, not the survey, the original deed. Caleb looked at the paper. The original deed was 40 years old, filed by the previous owner before Caleb ever purchased the land. Attacking it was a long shot, legally, but long shots filed in the right office, with enough money behind them, had a way of becoming shorter than they should be, and Marcus Vale had the money and the patience for exactly this kind of grinding siege. Birch arrived within the hour of Caleb's message reaching him, and he sat with Derry for 3 hours, while Caleb kept Ethan occupied outside with fence work, and Eliza sat in the sitting room with the cedar box in her lap and the sound of male voices from the kitchen moving through, the walls like the sound of something being built. When Birch came out to the porch, his expression had that particular, compressed energy again. "The notebook is sufficient," he said. "Combined with the Garrett letter and the water records, it builds a case that a territorial court cannot politely set aside." He paused. "Derry will need to testify." "He says he will. Whether he means it when the moment comes is a different question, but he says he will." "And the deed challenge?" Caleb asked. "That," Birch said, "is where we hit them first, before they hit us. We file a counter-petition with the Land Commission, attached to everything we have, and we make the case so public and so well documented that proceeding with the challenge becomes more expensive for Vale, politically and legally, than abandoning it." He looked at Caleb. "I need 2 days to write the filings. Can you hold things together for 2 days?" "Yes," Caleb said. Birch went back inside to continue with Derry. Ethan came up from the south fence line at that point, with mud on his boots and the look of a boy who has been thinking out there among the fence posts. He stopped beside his father on the porch steps. "Is it going to be okay?" he asked. Caleb looked at his son, 12 years old, the same jaw as his mother, the same way of asking a question directly when he decided the situation warranted it. "I think so," Caleb said. "Not tomorrow, but I think so." Ethan looked at the house, at the lit kitchen window, where the shapes of men with papers were visible through the glass. "He's going to stay," Ethan said. It was not quite a question. "Going to stay," Caleb said. The boy nodded, absorbed it, let it settle somewhere it could hold. Then he went inside to see her, and Caleb heard the sound of her voice, lower than the kitchen voices, coming from the sitting room, not the words, just the sound of it, steady and present. And he stood on the porch a moment longer, with the rain still in the air and the cottonwood moving in the east wind, and he thought about the man, Marcus Vale, what he had set in motion 7 years ago, and what he was still trying to set in motion now, and he thought about what it meant that all the money and the planning and the deliberate flooding of a road had not managed to make Eliza Whitmore disappear. She had gone into the river, and she had come back. Not the same, not whole, not without the cost of it written all over her in ways that would probably never fully erase, but back, and tomorrow, and the day after, and however many days it took to finish what Birch was now building in the kitchen, they would get through those too. That was the only thing Caleb Whitmore was completely certain of, standing on the porch of his own house, in the cooling evening, with his son's voice audible inside and his wife's voice answering. They would get through those too. Birch filed the counter-petition on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon the news had moved through Red Hollow the way all significant news moves through a small town faster than the people carrying it, arriving at places before the carriers did, already changed slightly in the telling, by the time it reached the far edges. What people heard, in the various versions that circulated through the general store and the feed yard, and the barbershop, and the 3 saloons that Red Hollow supported for a town of its size, was this: that Samuel Birch, the lawyer from 40 miles east, had filed a document with the Territorial Land Commission that was reported to be 40 pages long, and attached to it a set of supporting materials that included a signed witness account, a county water log, a letter from a dead land agent, and a leather notebook filled with dates and figures and names. That the filing named Marcus Vale directly, that it named Cole Derry, that it alleged fraud, conspiracy, and deliberate manipulation of public waterway resources. that it asked the territorial court to invalidate every land transaction Marcus Vale had conducted in Red Hollow County in the past 10 years pending investigation. By Saturday morning, Marcus Vale had left Red Hollow, not fled, that was the word people reached for, but Caleb, when Tom Holt brought him this information, understood the distinction. Marcus Vale was not the kind of man who fled. He was the kind of man who repositioned. He had a house in the territorial capital, connections there, lawyers there, and he had clearly decided that Red Hollow was no longer the right ground to defend. He had packed his household staff and his personal effects and ridden out before dawn. And the grand house on the North Hill sat empty with its curtains drawn, and the ranch hands he employed had shown up that morning to find no instructions and no pay waiting. "He's not gone," Caleb said. "No," Tom agreed. "He's not gone, but he's not here." The difference between those two things mattered, and Caleb knew it, and he did not let himself treat Mark Vale's departure as anything more than a change of terrain. The filings were with the territorial court. The circuit judge was due in 2 weeks. What happened in those 2 weeks would determine whether the weight of what Birch had built was sufficient to bring the kind of force to bear that Vale's money and distance could not simply wait out. Cole Derry, for his part, had not left. This surprised Caleb more than Vale's departure. Derry had agreed to testify, said he would stay. But the agreement of a frightened man and the actual behavior of a frightened man are often different things, and Caleb had prepared himself for the possibility that Derry would be gone by morning. Instead, Derry had taken a room at the smaller of Red Hollow's 2 boarding houses, not the one on Mercer Street, where he'd been using a false name, but a different one, under his own name, and he had been seen that Saturday eating breakfast in the dining room with the patient, settled quality of a man who has made a decision and is living inside it. Eliza received this information without visible surprise. "He has a daughter," she said. "He's made the calculation that what's in the notebook is safer as testimony than as a secret. A secret can be taken from you. Testimony is already out." Caleb looked at her. "When did you work that out?" he asked. "On the porch, while Birch was inside with him." She looked at the table. "I've had 7 years to learn how frightened people think. I was one." There were things she said now, occasionally, that had that quality, the direct, flat acknowledgement of what the years between the river and Red Hollow had actually been. She didn't say these things for sympathy and didn't want any offered. She said them because they were accurate, and accuracy had become, in the absence of almost everything else, the thing she held on to. The nightmares were still coming. Caleb knew this because the ranch house was not large, and he was a light sleeper, and sometimes in the deepest part of the night he heard her in the kitchen, not distressed sounds, crying, just the particular quiet movements of a person who has woken from something bad and is putting themselves back together with the practical tools available. He had gone down once, in the 2nd week, to find her sitting at the table with a cup of water and her hands flat on the surface, the way she put her hands flat on surfaces when she was locating herself. He had sat across from her without speaking, and she had not told him to go back to bed, and they had sat like that for 20 minutes until her hands relaxed, and she said she was fine, and he said okay, and they both went back to their respective rooms. He had not offered to hold her. That wasn't where they were yet. And he was not the kind of man who pretended things were further along than they were because he wanted them to be. They were 2 people who were rebuilding something, and rebuilding was not the same as having built it again. It was slower. It was made of different materials. It required a different kind of patience than either of them had been naturally born with, and both of them were learning it, clumsily in real time. Ethan saw more than they gave him credit for. This was always true of children. In complicated situations, they develop a peripheral vision for the adult emotional landscape around them that the adults consistently underestimate. He saw the way his father checked the kitchen in the morning before coming fully downstairs. He saw the way his mother touched the fence posts and gate latches and the bark of the cottonwood as if the physical world required constant confirmation. He saw the two of them sitting across a table, not quite touching, in the particular proximity of negotiating the distance between where they are and where they want to be. He was 12, and he did not have language for all of this, but he had his own response to it, which was to be present, to show up at meals, to talk about the horses and the fence line and the dog he still wanted to bring home, to fill the space with ordinary things, as if ordinary things were a kind of infrastructure that the harder things could lean on. It was not nothing. It was actually, in the economy of that household, quite a lot. The circuit judge arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after Birch filed the counter petition. His name was Arthur Crane, and he was 64 years old, and he had been riding the territorial circuit for 19 years. It meant he had seen most of the varieties of human dishonesty that the frontier produced, and had developed a corresponding impatience with the elaborate versions. He read Birch's filing in one sitting, in the small office the county provided for circuit business, and he sent word to Birch the following morning that he would hear arguments Thursday, and that he expected all named parties to be present or represented. Marcus Vail was not in Red Hollow. He sent Arden Crow. Crow came back from the capital, looking like a man who had received instructions he didn't entirely approve of, but was too professional to refuse. He arrived Wednesday evening and went directly to the courthouse, without stopping at his usual accommodation, and Tom Holt, who had developed the habit of knowing where relevant people were at all times, tracked this and reported it to Caleb that evening. "He's preparing something," Tom said. "He's always preparing something," Caleb replied. "Something different." He stopped at the telegraph office before the courthouse, sent a wire. Caleb looked at him. "To the capital?" Caleb asked. "To somewhere east of the capital," Tom said. "Couldn't get more than that." Birch, when informed, was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Vail is reaching for a political solution. If he can get someone at the commission level to slow the proceedings, delay the hearing, create enough procedural complexity." He paused. "We need Thursday to happen as scheduled. Whatever Crow has wired for, it won't arrive before Thursday if we move fast enough." They moved fast enough. Thursday morning, the courtroom on the upper floor of the Red Hollow courthouse was more full than it had been for the identity hearing 6 weeks prior. The news of what the filing contained had done what news of that kind does. In a small community, it had reorganized loyalties. People who had waited to see which way things fell were now visible in their waiting having ended. Martha Greer, who had cut off the Whitmore account's credit at her store, was present in the third row with an expression that was doing considerable work trying to look neutral. Agnes Calloway was in the front row with her grandson, sitting with the settled authority of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment for 6 years, and has arrived appropriately early. Eliza sat at the table beside Birch with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her eyes on Judge Crane, who was reading something with the focused attention of a man who genuinely reads rather than performs reading. Colderry sat in the witness gallery. He had come in without drama, taken a seat, and looked at nothing in particular with the expression of a man running a continuous internal argument that he'd already resolved but couldn't stop re-examining. When Eliza had entered the room, his eyes had gone to her face and stayed there for a moment, and she had looked back at him with the same expression she'd given him in the kitchen, not warm, not forgiving, but not looking away either. Crow opened, for Vail's interests, with the argument Birch had anticipated, procedural. The filing was premature. The evidence was unverified. The witness he gestured toward Derry without naming him was a party with self-interested motivation to misrepresent. The Territorial Commission had not been given adequate time to review the materials. He requested a 90-day continuance. Judge Crane listened to this with his chin resting on one hand. When Crow finished, Crane said, "Mr. Crow, in your experience, how long does a man leave a millwork adjustment in the county water log before someone connects it to a flood?" Crow blinked. "Your Honor, that's a rhetorical question," Crane said. "Been 7 years. The commission has had the filing for 11 days. 90 more days benefits one party and one party only in this room, and I don't believe that party is justice. Motion denied, Mr. Birch. Proceed. What Birch built over the next 4 hours in that courtroom was not elegant. Elegance was not what the situation called for. What it called for was weight the accumulated, documented, cross-referenced weight of 7 years of Marcus Vale's maneuvering, assembled piece by piece, witness by witness, record by record, until the structure of it was visible to everyone in the room and could not be unseen. He started with the survey records. The original filing, the amended filing with the cut binding, the gap where 2 pages had been removed. He produced a county archivist who testified to the physical evidence of the cut not torn, not lost, cut with a blade, and who confirmed that the filing number sequence indicated the removal had occurred within 18 months of the original amendment, which placed it in the period following Eliza's disappearance. He moved to the water log, the millwork adjustment 3 days before the flood on Vale's property, filed under a maintenance designation. Produced the county engineer who had calculated, soberly and without drama, what that adjustment would have done to the Taro water level at the Gable Ford given the existing rainfall conditions. He produced the Garrett letter. Crow objected to the letter on grounds of hearsay. Crane considered it for 30 seconds and overruled, noting that statements made by a now absent party in anticipation of legal consequence carried sufficient weight for consideration. Then Birch called Cole Derry to the stand. Derry walked to the witness chair with the walk of a man who is committed to something and is keeping his eyes forward because looking sideways would cost him his nerve. He sat down. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at Birch, testified for an hour and 40 minutes. He described, in the flat, precise language of a man who has decided that accuracy is now his only available form of integrity, everything in the leather notebook and more. Conversations with Vale, the specific instructions regarding the survey records, payment for services, the millwork adjustment which he had filed himself under Vale's direction on a morning in April of 1871, the reason given to him, which was irrigation management, the thing he had understood the real reason to be, which he stated without softening, that Vale had learned. Eliza Whitmore was in possession of documents that demonstrated his survey fraud, and that Vale intended those documents to not arrive at the Whitmore ranch. Did Mr. Vale state to you directly that he intended to harm Mrs. Moore? Birch asked. No, Derry said. He said she needed to be delayed. He said the crossing would handle it. Did you understand what he meant by that? A pause. I told myself I didn't. Another pause. But I understood. Crow's cross-examination of Derry was careful and technically competent and ultimately ineffective. Because Derry had the thing that is hardest to argue against in a courtroom, he was not trying to look good. He was not performing remorse or strategically minimizing his role. He answered Crow's attempts to undermine his credibility with the same flat directness he'd used with Birch. And when Crow suggested his testimony was self-serving, Derry said, probably, but it's also true. Those aren't always opposites. Crane wrote something down when Derry said that. When Eliza took the stand, the courtroom was at the particular quality of silence that a room reaches when everyone in it has been present for something significant and knows it. She sat in the witness chair, and she looked at Birch, and she answered his questions with the directness she had brought to every hard thing since walking back into this life. She described the visit to Garrett's office. She described the papers. She described seeing Derry leave through the back. She described the crossing, the sound of the water, the speed of it, the piece of wood she'd held onto, and she described what came after, the years of not knowing who she was, the fragmented surfacing of a self she had to reassemble from scraps, with the patience of someone who had no choice but to be patient. Crow did not cross-examine her extensively. He asked 3 questions. She answered all 3 without wavering. He sat down. Judge Crane took a recess of 40 minutes. He came back with the settled bearing of a man who had done his thinking and was ready to deliver the result of it. What he delivered was not a verdict in the criminal sense. This was a civil and administrative proceeding, not a criminal trial, and Crane was careful to make that distinction. But his ruling had the weight of a verdict. He found the Territorial Land Commission petition filed on Vale's behalf to be without merit and dismissed it. He ordered a formal investigation into the survey record alterations to be conducted by a territorial officer, naming Marcus Vale as the primary subject. He referred the matter of the millwork adjustment and its consequences to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office with a formal recommendation for criminal inquiry. He entered into the record a finding that Eliza Whitmore had been a victim of deliberate fraud, and that her interests and the interests of the Whitmore Ranch had been materially damaged by that fraud. He looked at Eliza when he said the last part. The law moves slowly, he said, with the directness of a man who had spent 19 years watching it do exactly that. Justice and law are not the same thing, and I won't tell you they are. What this court can do today, it has done. The room exhaled. It did not break into celebration. This was not that kind of room, and these were not that kind of people. And what had happened was too complicated for simple celebration. But something shifted. Martha Greer, in the third row, was looking at her hands. Agnes Calloway had her eyes closed and her chin slightly lifted, the expression of someone receiving something they'd waited for long enough that receiving it had become an act of its own. Tom Holt, standing near the back, looked at Caleb across the room with the expression of a young deputy who had made several difficult choices in the past weeks and was registering for the first time that they had been the right ones. Caleb looked at Eliza. She was still sitting at the table. She hadn't moved yet. She was looking at the middle distance, the way she looked when something was trying to settle, and her hands were flat on the table in front of her, the locating gesture, the one she used when she needed to know where she was. He went to her. He sat in the empty chair beside her, the one Birch had vacated, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything. And they sat like that while the room moved around them, people rising and talking, and the sound of the proceeding dispersing into ordinary human noise. After a while, she said, "He's still out there." "Vale," Caleb said. "Yes, he's out there, with an investigation attached to his name, and a prosecutor looking at his conduct, and nothing left to do in Red Hollow," Caleb said. "That's different from where he was. It's not finished. No. But it's a different kind of not finished than it was." She turned and looked at him, and the expression on her face was the most complicated thing he had ever seen on a human face, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Because it was a woman who had survived something that should have destroyed her, sitting in a courthouse in the town that had doubted her, the nurse next to the man who hadn't, the end of a day that had moved several large things from one column to another, and feeling all of that simultaneously without being able to make it simple. "I want to go home," she said. "Okay," he said. They rode back to the ranch in the wagon, the three of them, with Birch following behind in his usual battered conveyance. Ethan sat between his parents and did not talk for most of the ride, which was unusual for him. And when Caleb glanced at him, he saw that Ethan was looking at the road ahead with the expression of someone who is integrating something large. After about a mile, Ethan reached over and took his mother's hand. He didn't say anything when he did it. She looked at their joined hands, and then she looked at the road and she held on. The weeks that followed were not simple, because nothing about any of this had ever been simple or was going to become simple now. The territorial investigation into Marcus Vale was officially opened, which meant the involvement of officers from outside Red Hollow, which meant depositions and document reviews and the particular grinding machinery of official inquiry that moves forward slowly and can't be hurried. Birch made 2 more trips to the county seat. Cole Derry testified twice more before different officials, and each time held to the same account with the same flat accuracy that had characterized his courthouse testimony. Each time he went back to the boarding house afterward and continued his patient waiting. Eliza was asked to give her own deposition twice. She did it both times, and each time came back from it quieter than she'd left. Not broken, just carrying more weight temporarily. Caleb learned to read the evenings after those days, to have supper ready, to let Ethan carry the conversation at the table, to not ask how it went until she was ready to say. She was not easy to live with. That was a true thing, and Caleb did not pretend otherwise even to himself. She had sharp edges that 7 years of survival had put on her that were not going to sand away overnight, or perhaps ever. She had opinions that she expressed without apology. She had ways of going silent that could fill a room more effectively than speaking. Silences that had weight and direction to them, that required Caleb to make decisions about whether to enter or wait. She made decisions about the ranch without always consulting him. First, not out of disrespect, but out of the ingrained habit of a woman who had learned to rely entirely on herself, and it occasionally produced friction that they had to talk through, sometimes unsuccessfully the first time, and better the second. She was not the woman she had been at 26, which was the age she'd been when the river took her. She was something different, not worse, not better, but different in the way that people who have been through the deep water are different from the people they were before. She had a patience in some areas that she hadn't had before, and an impatience in others. She had a directness that occasionally alarmed people who were not expecting it. She had the particular quality of a person who no longer wastes time on things that don't matter, because she has a specific and physical understanding of how much time can be taken from a person. Caleb was not always equal to all of this. There were evenings when his own accumulated years of sealed-off grief and single-handed management of everything broke through the surface and made him short or distant, when the patience he was working to build failed him, and he said something wrong or said nothing when he should have said something. There were mornings when she looked at him with the expression of someone who is measuring the distance between who he is and who she needs him to be, and measurement wasn't comfortable for either of them. They were building something. Buildings have setbacks. That was the truth of it, and they both understood it. And the understanding didn't make the setbacks less frustrating, but it made them less catastrophic than they might have been with two different people. Marcus Vale was formally charged in the 7th week after the Crane hearing. The charges came from the territorial prosecutor's office and included fraud, conspiracy, falsification of public records, and in the careful, qualified language of a prosecutor who had sufficient evidence to proceed, but was being precise about the limits of what the evidence showed: unlawful interference with a navigable waterway resulting in harm. Criminal charge regarding the waterway was the weakest of them, legally, and everyone involved understood that it might not survive a skilled defense. But the fraud and conspiracy charges were solid, built on the documentary foundation that Birch had assembled and Derry had supported with testimony, and they were the kind of charges that, once attached to a man's name in a territorial court filing, did not let go quietly. Vale hired 3 lawyers. The case was going to take time. Territorial proceedings always did, and Vale had the resources to make them take more time than they should. But the investigation had frozen his land holdings pending resolution, which meant the southern pasture was no longer in dispute. The water access was no longer in dispute, and the slow grinding pressure campaign he had been running on the Whitmore property for 2 years had stopped, because the man running it was occupied with his own considerable legal problems. Caleb received the news of the charges on a Tuesday morning, brought by Tom Holt, who had developed the habit of coming to the ranch at irregular intervals, with information he felt Caleb should have. He read the charging document on the porch, and then he set it on the rail and looked out at the property, the south pasture, the east fence, the cottonwood, all of it, in the particular clear light of a late fall morning. He felt something that was not triumph, not relief exactly, though relief was in it. It was something more like the settling of a weight that he'd been carrying at an angle. For so long he'd stopped noticing it was angled, and now it had been set down and leveled, and his body was registering the difference. Eliza came out and stood beside him. She had seen Tom arrive and leave, and she had given him time to read and process. which was one of the things she had learned about him, that he needed the first few minutes of a piece of news alone before he was ready to share the weight of it. She looked at the charging document on the rail. She didn't pick it up. Is it enough? She asked. It's enough for now, Caleb said. The criminal case will take time. I know. You may have to testify again. I know that too. She looked at the south pasture. He's not going to walk away from this. Whatever the lawyers manage to reduce or delay, he's not walking away from this the way he thought he would when he opened that millwork. She said it with certainty, not anger, not vindication, just the flat assessment of someone who has had a long time to think about what she is owed and has decided not to waste energy on the emotion around it. I don't need to watch it happen in real time. I just need to know it's moving. It's moving, Caleb said. She nodded. They stood on the porch for a while longer. The fall morning continued around them, the horses in the lower pasture, moving the way horses move when the air is cold and they feel like running. The cottonwood going gold at the edges in a way that would be complete by next week, particular quality of October light that makes everything look like it's been considered rather than just lit. I remembered something last night, she said. He looked at her. Our first winter here, she said. There was a storm, a bad one. Took the roof off the barn, or most of it, and we spent 3 days trying to patch it with what we had, and it kept not being enough, and I was furious at the barn. Specifically, like the barn was doing it on purpose. She paused. And on the 3rd day, you climbed up there in the sleet, and you slipped, and you slid most of the way down the roof before you caught yourself on the beam at the edge. And I was so scared, I couldn't speak for about 30 seconds. And then I was so angry at you for scaring me that I shouted at you while you were still on the roof, and you shouted back, and we both said things we hadn't said to each other before, and some of them were true, and some of them were just fear to talk. She stopped. Caleb was very still. You came down off the roof eventually, she said, and we stood in the barn in the sleet with the broken roof, and we were both cold and angry and scared, and then one of us started laughing. I don't remember who, but once one of us started, the other one couldn't stop it. He looked at her. I remember the barn, he said quietly. I remember the sleet. I remember what you said when I was on the roof. Which part? The part about the beam not being the only thing without any sense in that yard. She almost laughed. The almost law that had been getting closer to real for weeks finally made it brief, real, slightly surprised at itself. The laugh of a person rediscovering something they'd thought was gone. It was not a fixed thing, that laugh. It was a moment, and it passed, and what came after it was ordinary. They went inside. Ethan came down for breakfast. The day started its usual accumulation of work and weather and small decisions. But the moment had happened, and both of them knew it had happened, and it settled into the house alongside the other things that had been settling there. The east-facing room, the blue speckled pot, the tobacco tin under the floorboard, the cedar box on the shelf in Ethan's room, all the small material evidence of a life that had been interrupted and was being, piece by careful piece, resumed. Cole Derry left Red Hollow in November. He came to the ranch before he left. He stood on the porch and told Caleb that he'd given the territorial investigator everything he had and had told he could go, that his testimony was on record and he'd be summoned if needed for trial. He said it with the minimal words of a man who had said all the important things already in a courtroom and had nothing left to add outside one. He asked to speak to Eliza. She came to the door and stood in the frame and looked at him on the porch step. I'm going back to my daughter, he said. I don't know what she'll be told. Probably not all of it. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, tell her the truth when she's old enough. Not for your sake, for hers. Children who find out later that their parents hid things that cost them more than the truth would have. Derry absorbed that. I will, he said. And then after a pause, I'm sorry. I know that's not worth much. It's worth something, she said. Not as much as you'd like it to be, but something. He nodded. He got on his horse. He rode out, and neither of them watched him until he was out of sight, because he was not the part of this story they wanted to hold on to. Spring came, as it does, without asking anyone's permission. Columbine came back in the patch on the east side of the stone wall, the way it had come back every year since Eliza had planted it in the second year of the ranch. This time she was there to see it. She crouched beside the wall one morning and looked at the flowers with an expression that Ethan, watching from a distance, would later describe to a friend as the quietest happy he'd ever seen on a person's face. She had been remembering more. Not in the dramatic way of the early weeks, not the sudden floods of specific detail, but in the steady, ordinary way that memory works when it's been given time and safety, small things surfacing unprompted while she was doing other things. A recipe she hadn't thought about in years, appearing intact while she was making something else. The name of a girl she'd known at school, arriving while she was mending a fence. The sound of her own mother's voice, which she had not recovered until February, and which, when it came, sat her down on the kitchen floor for several minutes before she was able to get up again. She did not recover everything. There were years still missing, not in the traumatic scrambled way of the early weeks, but simply gone the way any. Years go when enough time passes, the way any person's past has areas of darkness that the present can't fully illuminate. This was not a wound anymore exactly. It was more like a scar, functional, present, not the same as the original skin, but hers. She had asked Birch, in the winter, about what she was legally entitled to pursue beyond the civil restoration of her status. Birch had given her the careful answer of a man who wanted to be accurate rather than encouraging. Criminal case against Vale would move on its own timeline. Her civil status was restored. The land was secure. Whether Vale eventually served time depended on a prosecution she would not control and a jury she would not choose. She had listened to all of that and then asked, with the directness that still occasionally disarmed Birch, "And the women like me? The ones whose husbands didn't wait? The ones who came back and found nothing?" Birch had not had a good answer to that. She had thought about it through the winter. In March, she wrote a letter to the territorial governor's office. It was not a petition, it was more personal than a petition, and more specific. It described in plain language the legal situation of women who had suffered identity displacement through no fault of their own, and the inadequacy of the existing framework for addressing their claims to property and personhood. It cited specific gaps. It suggested specific remedies. She did not expect a response. She sent it because it needed to be sent. To her considerable surprise, a response came in April. A form letter from an administrative office, largely useless, but attached to it was a handwritten note from an aide who said the letter had been passed along and that similar letters had been received and that there was, apparently, interest in the topic at a level above the administrative office. She showed Caleb the note. He read it and handed it back. "You're going to keep writing," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "Ethan, that spring finally brought home the dog. It was a medium-sized animal of entirely unclear heritage, found at the edge of town in a condition that suggested it had been surviving on what the alley behind the butcher shop produced, which was apparently sufficient. Ethan brought it home on a Tuesday afternoon and set it on the porch and looked with the expression of someone who has thought carefully about their argument and is ready to deploy it. Caleb looked at the dog. The dog looked at Caleb with the specific expression of an animal that has recently had cause to doubt human intentions and is withholding full commitment. "It needs a name," Eliza said from the doorway. Both of them looked at her. "It's staying?" Ethan said. "It's staying," she said. "What are you going to call it?" "I haven't decided," Ethan said, with the expression of someone who had absolutely decided and was waiting for the right moment. "What did you decide?" she asked. "Gable," he said, "for the ford." The ford where she had gone into the river. The ford where, 7 years ago, everything had broken open. He had thought about that name, and he had chosen it, and the choosing of it was its own small act of courage, the decision not to let the worst thing about a place be the only thing about it. Caleb looked at his son. Eliza looked at her son. Ethan looked at the dog, which was now sitting more comfortably on the porch boards, as if the name had settled something for it as well. Gable it is, Caleb said. The summer was warm and work heavy and ordinary in the way that life returns to ordinary after extraordinary things, which is to say not entirely ordinary, not without the awareness of what had come before, functional and daily, and full of the specific small satisfactions of work done and seasons turning and a household finding its shape. Marcus Vale's trial was scheduled for the following winter, more than a year after Crane's hearing. Birch continued to prepare. Eliza continued to correspond with the territorial governor's office and had, by July, received a response from someone more senior than an aide. The response was cautious, as official responses always are, but it used the word consideration, and Birch, when he read it, said that consideration from that office was more than he'd have predicted 6 months ago. Tom Holt made deputy sheriff in August, which was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. Sheriff Granger in Shitz made the announcement, who understood that the wind had shifted and intended to demonstrate that he had always been facing the right direction. Agnes Calloway came to supper one Sunday in September. She sat at the kitchen table and ate with the appetite of a woman who had been feeding herself for 81 years and knew what she liked. And she talked to Ethan about the history of the Calloway family's arrival in Red Hollow 40 years ago, in a way that was clearly designed to give Ethan a sense that the town had a past worth knowing. The people in it had stories that went back further than his own crisis. Ethan listened to all of it with the attentiveness of a boy who had learned, young and hard, that the stories of the people around him mattered. After supper, Agnes and Eliza sat on the porch in the cooling evening, while Caleb and Ethan handled the dishes a new arrangement. Reese arrived at without ceremony, and Agnes said something to Eliza that Caleb did not hear, and Eliza later did not repeat in full. What she did say, when he asked what they'd talked about, was, she said that the town is embarrassed. Not all of it, but enough of it. She said embarrassment can be a useful thing if it moves in the right direction. Does she think it will? Caleb asked. She thinks as it might. Eliza paused. She said Red Hollow is not a bad town. It's a cautious one, and cautious towns follow the example of the people who refuse to be cautious. Caleb looked at her. She was talking about you, he said. She was talking about both of us, Eliza said, and Ethan, and Tom Holt. She considered in Birch, and, strangely, Derry, in a backhanded way. There was something in that worth sitting with, and they sat with it, on the porch in the September evening with the dog Gable, asleep on the boards between their chairs, and the cottonwood going early toward autumn, and the south pasture lying quiet in the last light under a sky that was doing what frontier skies do, in September turning colors that don't have names yet, burning through them quickly, going dark. Here is the thing about survival, the true thing, underneath all the legal proceedings and the court hearings and the dramatic reversals of fortune. It is not an event. It is not the moment you come out of the water, or the moment the ruling is read, or the moment the charges are filed. Those are markers. Those are the moments the story tells itself in. But survival is what happens in the Tuesday mornings and the ordinary suppers and the nights you wake up from the bad dream and find the kitchen and put your hands flat on the table, choosing over and over, with no audience and no verdict coming, to get up and go back to the work of being alive. Eliza Whitmore had been doing that choosing for 7 years, before anyone knew she was doing it. She had done it in circumstances that would have ended most people, in the absence of everything that makes choosing easier: home, family, identity, memory, the basic continuity of self that most people never have to think about because they've never had it taken. She had done it anyway, the way the columbine comes back every spring, not because it's been encouraged or applauded or ruled in favor of by any court, but because that is what it does, what it cannot help doing, what it is made for. The river had taken her. The river had not finished her. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference is not about luck or fate or the intervention of any force outside the human. The difference is about what a person does in the water, whether they find the piece of wood and hold on. She had held on. And here, On the far side of everything that holding on had cost her was a kitchen that smelled of supper, and a boy who named a dog for the place where she almost didn't make it, and a man who had not moved the tobacco tin from under the floorboard in 7 years, because moving it would have meant accepting a thing he wasn't willing to accept, and a town that was beginning slowly, with the particular embarrassed shuffle of communities that have been wrong, to turn in a different direction. None of it was finished. The trial would come. The letters would need writing. The memories that were gone would stay gone, and the ones that came back would come back imperfect, and the marriage being rebuilt out of two people who were not the same people who had made it the first time would have its fractures and its friction and its evenings when the distance between where they were and where they wanted to be felt longer than they could stand. None of that was the story. Or rather, all of that was the story. The true version of it, the one that doesn't resolve into simplicity because real things don't. What happened to Eliza Whitmore was not a parable with a clean lesson at the end. It was a life, interrupted and resumed, continued against considerable resistance, imperfect in its resumption in all the ways that matter, and correct in its resumption in the way that matters most. She came back, not to what she had lost. You cannot go back to what you have lost, but to the place where the lost things had been, where the surviving things still were, where the new things were beginning to take root in the disturbed soil of everything that had been turned over. On the last warm evening of September, she walked out to the Taro River alone. She had not gone there since returning to Red Hollow. She had walked every part of the ranch property, had driven past the road that led toward the Gable Ford, but she had not gone to the river. She went now without telling anyone where she was going, not out of secrecy, but out of the understanding that this was something she needed to do in her own company. The river at that time of year was low and clear, running quiet over the stones in the shallows. It looked nothing like what she remembered, but memory of water is a specific thing, because water is never the same water, and the river that had nearly taken her was not this river, except in the way that all rivers are the same river, the way all loss is related to all other loss, the way survival speaks a language that all survivors recognize across the specific details of their different disasters. She stood on the bank for a long time. She was not forgiving the river. The river didn't require forgiveness, it was water, moving because water moves, indifferent in the way that nature is indifferent, without malice and without mercy. What had happened to her had not been the river's design. The river had been the instrument. The instrument was not what she had come to settle with. She had come because she needed to look at it. Because the worst thing about the years she'd lost was that the last thing she'd seen before losing herself was water, fast and cold, and everywhere. And she had not been able to choose the thing she saw last before she chose to come back. She had not been able to give herself a different picture. So she was giving herself a different one now. The river in September, low and clear and quiet, the last of the sun on it going gold and then fading, the sound of it in the cooling air, peaceful in the way that only things without memory can be peaceful. She stood there until the light was gone. Then she turned and walked back toward the ranch house, where the kitchen window was lit, and through the lit window she could see the shape of Caleb at the stove and the smaller shape of Ethan at the table, and the dog probably underfoot somewhere. And all of it ordinary, all of it real, all of it hers, in the way that things are yours not because no one can take them, but because you have been through what it costs to keep them. She walked toward the light. Behind her, the river kept moving, the way rivers do, indifferent and constant, carrying everything and remembering nothing, out towards somewhere she did not need to follow. She was already home.